Hey, in this chapter, what we're taking a look at here is the civil rights movement. So the period of time that we're going to be covering, at least for this next time period that we're discussing, is going to be about 1950, and we're going to take it all the way up to what is essentially the end of President Johnson's time in office, which is 1968. So we're kind of going right back to the time frame that we've done the last couple of chapters, which is right where we're going to see President Truman kind of step out of office, and we're going to see President Eisenhower step in, then through Presidents Kennedy and President Johnson. And what we're going to see here is that there's something unique about the 1950s and 1960s that makes the civil rights movement gain strength, gain speed, and achieve more of its objectives. So what we want to look at is why that happens. Why is it that the civil rights movement is going to make gains in post-war America? Why in the 1950s and 60s does it become successful? And then what's going to motivate our society to make changes and actually embrace these changes that the civil rights movement is pushing for in the 1950s and 1960s? And I think the thing to take from this is that it's a long, slow process that's going to pick up speed over time and put pressure on America. And that pressure begins in the 1950s once we come to the realization, North and South, that there still are two types of segregation in America. A legal segregation that we're familiar with, right, with Jim Crow laws, right? When the Supreme Court passes Plessy versus Ferguson, and it says that we're allowed to have separate but equal, we're allowed to have segregation, this doctrine of separate but equal means that our country legally can be separate, right? And we know that in 1898, or 1896 rather, when we condone segregation, we're going to enter that period that's going to run all the way up to 1954 when we see a legal challenge to that that's going to be successful. So that's legal segregation. And of course, remember the laws that we actually passed to enforce segregation, those are Jim Crow laws. But there's another kind of segregation as well, one that we don't really mention as much in our class or even in American society, and that's going to be de facto segregation. And that's kind of like segregation that we just accept as fact, as tradition, instead of legally. And let me give you an example of what de facto segregation can look like. So here's a little chart for you, a little infograph that talks about just in the last 30, 35 years, what neighborhoods look like in American cities and in American states. So if we said, okay, let's take your typical neighborhood for whites that you see up here on that top row, and let's just see what that looks like over time. What we'll see is that in 1980, there was a very small percentage of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans living in white neighborhoods. And look, between 1980 to 1990 to 2000 to 2010, that percentage has rarely changed. In other words, if you lived in a typically white neighborhood in 1980, chances are that same neighborhood in 2009, 2010, it's going to look the same, be about the same percentage white. You can do the same thing if you live at a typically African-American neighborhood. So in 1980, a typically African-American neighborhood was split roughly 50-50, 44-45 black-white with a small percentage of Latinos. Over time, a typical black neighborhood, if you look, it's about the same, right? About the same population of whites, a little more Hispanics, some fewer African Americans, but again, not much of a dramatic shift. And the same thing can be said for Latino neighborhoods. Those look about the same as well. America's neighborhoods in her cities, in her towns, in her states, they're as segregated now, for the most part, as they were in 1980. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of segregation by tradition, not by law. There's no law saying it has to be that way, but the tradition is that it is that way. Now, there are some victories against segregation, whether that's de facto or whether it's legal segregation, before the 1950s. And I put them here for you, whether that's World War II factories being integrated, whether that's Jackie Robinson desegregating baseball in 1942, the Truman integration of the military in 48, and so on. But the real assaults on segregation won't begin until the 1950s when the civil rights movement gets organized And it's that organization which is going to put pressure on America, right? It's a long, slow process that's going to pick up speed with organization, and that organization is going to allow pressure to be exerted on white society in the 50s and 60s. And the group that does it is the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And their method of persuasion, their method of pressure, is something called the sit-in. It's a form of protest, and CORE members, white and black, they'll go to restaurants, movie theaters, public pools, other kinds of facilities across the country, north and south, Chicago, Detroit, Denver, Syracuse, all in the north to start. And they will sit at segregated areas and force desegregation. So you see these people come in, whites and blacks, they sit together, boom, in an area that's supposed to be all for whites. The manager comes along and says, hey, you black people need to move. The whites and blacks together say, no, we're not moving. Make us. The police come in, the police have to drag them all out, and then they repeat the process again and again and again. What it does is create bad press, bad publicity, and it puts pressure on the owners because they're losing business. The more this kind of thing, and you can see here a lunch counter in the South being desegregated with members of CORE, white and black alike, sitting here getting things dumped on their heads. This is a loss of business for business owners, and that makes no sense. So they're going to put pressure on their governments to make change, and they're going to desegregate on their own. Did you notice where this desegregation starts, though? In the North. Why? Because it builds momentum in an area where it's not as violent. Remember, in the South, if you tried to get out of your place, if you were African American or if you were Latino, or if you were a white helping, you ran the risk of being lynched. In the North, that's not so bad, at least not as bad, the chances of being lynched. So it makes more sense to start in Detroit, Syracuse, etc., Denver, and then work your way south as you push for further and further desegregation.